Yeah.
So sorry, PM, but let's continue.
Okay. Okay. I'm gonna set my timer. If you wanna POI me, please just unmute yourself because I won't be listening. Um, because I won't be reading the chat. Um, okay. I'm gonna start my. Okay, wait. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before I start my speech, I'm gonna say that we as OO believe that the increased influence of consulting firms, especially in their involvement to create public policy, is something that are positive and that should be celebrated instead of regretted. Unlike what OG had said. A little bit of characteristic. First thing, what is a consulting firm, right? OG, I don't think OG have explained this. Consulting firm are firm to build dedicated to hire expert analysis in order to give advice and nudge or influence the people that hire them to create a better decision. That's their end goal, right? That's their objective. Second thing, consulting firm in this context is consulting firms that are hired by government body or government ministry in order to consult them on the decision making in order to create public policy. Government OG still haven't explained what public policy that are going or like example of public policy that are going to be talked about in this discussion. Which is probably just like health policy, education policy, and etc. Any policy, tax policy, any policy that would essentially involve the public and would essentially have an effect to the public, right? Thirdly, consulting firm is built and are being retained by people who are an actual expert in their field, filled with people that have doctorate degrees in their own specialty and field, and at least people who do have a degree and who do have an education in the field question. So health policy or health consulting firm are filled with people with doctorate degree in or like doctor degree or people who are in general have experience in the health industry, right? Fourth, clarification. The government ministry does not only have the obligation to fulfill the public interest, but also have the incentive to fulfill their own interest, which is to maintain their position of power by being able to gain vote, right? Meaning they do have an interest to create a good policy. This is very indisputable. That's why they wouldn't hire shady third-party consulting company if government want to say that a consulting company is untrustworthy, right? But instead, because of the motives that I have mentioned, and the reputation that are on the line of the government party, they would instead hire credible source or credible consulting firms such as the Big Four in Indonesia and etc. Right? Five, another clarification. We think that government should transparent. This is directly engaged with what OG had said. They claim that it's very bad for government to take credit or government body to take credit for the work of this consulting firm. But we think that government is already supposed to be transparent. That they would claim that whatever the decision that they make is because they hire a consultant or at least if you want to research the information is listed on public website or whatsoever, because the citizen would know that they have hired a consultant. But another justification why government bodies still deserve the credit is because in the end of the day, they still make the decision. Consultant firm doesn't have any say in what decision does the government would make. They could advise the government. They couldn't insist on the government though. They could advise them. They could nudge them, but they couldn't insist. It is still a fair trade because they did pay consulting firm, right? But it's not as outrageous amount as what OG have said, and I would explain later in my argument. A little bit of response to OG. OG is very concerned, and their whole justification on why they propose what they propose is because it's morally unjustified because it is the government job to be able to create policy. This is what OG said, right? I understand that government have the responsibility to create policy, but they also have the responsibility to be able to think logically and use any tool that are available to them to maximize and create the utmost beneficial policy that could benefit, not only benefit themselves, right, but also benefit their citizen. I'll explain later why citizen is such a vulnerable actor that need to be protected. What OG jargoning here is to basically sacrifice the potentiality for government to be able to release better policy just because it's morally unjust. In the case of practicality versus principality, we believe in this debate, we have practically won. Explain in my arguments. Continuing to my arguments read why government hiring consulting firm is actually a proactive things a government could do and why it should be celebrated, right? First layer, consulting firm is a good tools in a bureaucratic sense or in a bureaucratic environment. They serve as the credible check and balance in a bureaucratic sense. Why is it more effective to use consulting firm is because in a traditional bureaucracy, they don't serve good enough and check and balance. Yes, before a policy was made, and it's not efficient enough check and balance. Before a policy is made in traditional bureaucracy, it has to be confirmed by a lot of people, right? But those people, this is coming from the inherent fact that just because someone is a part of the office and are a part of the government body doesn't mean that they are. Yes, please.
The job of creating public policy is to ensure that it is careful. That's why bureaucracy exists, so that check and balance happen. So how would you ensure check and balance exists on your side?
Exactly. Okay, enough. I get what your point. Okay, so like people in the government body doesn't mean that they are qualified and have sufficient enough knowledge in order to create good public policy. Exactly because of that, it is very hard for them to create a check and balances that is actually a good check and balances. And it is not efficient because you know how much policy have been halted because it have to go through such a lengthy process to be released, right? With the existence of consulting firm, this could still exist. Healthy check and balances could still exist, and with the also added benefit of credible source, right? Example: to create health or education policy, not every politician is a doctor or have doctorate degree in health education, but someone in a consulting firm might have worked in a health field or education field, right? Logically, it would be more proactive as a government to let people who spend their life studying in this field of study and have enough credential to be able to consult government bodies in the creation of policy. Second layer, if government ministry would still decide in the end what's the impact of our stance, right? If government ministry would still decide in the end of the day what's the impact of our stance specifically, wouldn't it just ended up the same, since this same unqualified people would still create the decision? I think government's gonna bring this. It's still good for a couple of reasons. It is still more cost and resource efficient, and it could create better decision, hence because of the credibility. It is more cost efficient because it is also indisputable that government of one country have limited resource to run their bureaucracy. Rather than creating governmental research starting from zero in order to create efficient policy, it is more sensible that if government want to release policy to buy knowledge, the knowledge that already exists. Hence why we as OO believe that this could be better in the end. Thank you so much.
We thank the LO for that speech. A gentle reminder that nothing is written after 7:15, so you should just wrap up your speech by then. Continuing on the government side of the house, we call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, just checking, am I both audible and visible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Okay. For KOI, I think unmute. Over one to closing. If not, then opening, it's fine. I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. When this is a regret motions and turn motion, that means we are out to regret is the increasing influence and not the action of government that work together with the consulting firms. The burden in opening government is to prove why prior to this working with consulting firm is bad. What we ought to prove is why when you make this as a trend, and then every politicians are likely to work with firms even when they create a very simple policy such as building roads, adjusting traffic lights, etc. It is what we ought to oppose. I'm going to directly attack opening options.
Hello?
I think he cut off, yeah.
Okay. PM, can you contact your teammate? They have chow.
Aman, Kak.
Okay, we're gonna wait.
I think I was disconnected.
Yeah. Since it's just like 30 seconds, I think you should just restart your speech.
Okay.
But
Great, thank
can you
you.
ensure that your internet and everything's already good so it doesn't disconnect again?
Oh yeah, I think it's good. It's just like bad, bad behavior in which like my Wi-Fi was kind of disconnected at least once or twice in a day. But I think
Do
it
you
will not happen.
prefer not to turn on your camera?
I think it's fine. So yeah.
Okay, cool. You can just restart, yeah?
Right. We're gonna start in 3, 2, 1. So when this is a regret motions once again and trend motion, what we ought to regret in opening government is the increasing influence and like not the action of government that work together with the consulting firms. Therefore, the burden in our side is not to prove why prior to this working with consulting firm is bad. What we ought to prove is why when you make this as a trend and then every politicians are likely to work with firms even when they create a very simple policy, the burden that opening failed to defend, such as building roads, adjusting traffic lights, etc., is what we ought to oppose. I'm going to directly launch 3 points of attack to opening options. First, on transparency. I want to deal with the response that all give to us, which is like people are inherently rational, and I think like government have the incentive to provide us with transparent data and report. So I think people wouldn't choose bad politicians and all those stuffs. I agree and understand. However, this argument relying solely on two assumptions. One, this argument is completely ignoring the fact that most of the people do not know who make the policy for them. They only enjoy the end result, right? If you see how good IKN has been built, then you ought to see the beauty of president office, not who designed that office specifically. So that means if the end output of making this policy is good, then all normalized political transaction even more in their side, because politicians now have the incentive to give back to elites who fund their campaign, so they will likely to employ more businessmen, more obedient subordinates, the people who will not criticize their policies such as current government of Indonesia. So this is where meritocracy is experiencing their downfall. And we probably know we already did something wrong at this point, right? And I think bad meritocracy is signaling a negative quality. That is to say, if you're a doctor, then imagine your minister is nuclear engineering graduate. Do you think you will trust this minister? No. And this is what caused people to skeptic against government, not doing their obligation, pay tax, etc. This also signaling as if merit is not useful, so now society do not want to work hard because they know if your GPA is just like 2.3, you can be vice president. That means like the word that degrade merit is what we call as a bad output. The second thing is that this argument also completely ignores the fact that even if the data of policy is widely accessible, and for some magical reasons people can understand about the report provided by government, then it is worse on their side. So knowing the fact that the people who design your policy and make the prototype of that development is business consulting firms who cares about profit and do not care about people. And I think this harm exists right after you reveal the data, because now you're signaling that your politicians are unable to make the policy by themselves, given that the firm does not have any incentive to make that significant profit that cause even more distrust to GovBench. Second thing that I want to do in this speech is push the burden to up. Is there any better way to get the same quality of policy making even without consulting firm? Yes, there is way, which is our counterfactual. Our counterfactual is purely relying on government capacity. So I want to note why this is good in 3 chronological order. The first part is pre-election. I think Jason already explained this, why people would choose more meritful leaders. And I think there is a raising concern as well that if Gov failed to design a good policy, then we would mess up very, very bad. So there is a clear-cut urgency for people to learn politics, learn policy, to provide harsh criticism against government to perpetuate discussion even more. And I think this is exclusive because because oh, I cannot say, but people will quite literate it anyway in their side. No, because if consulting firm is that good, then people have no urgency to criticize the incumbent government because they think consulting firms can just solve everything else, right? The second thing is during the election process, I think this is bad in op because you decrease the participation of the people. Why? Because no matter who you elect, the one who will make the policy is the consulting firm. So here people are unlikely to advocate even harder, even aggressive, that make the overall political activity become stagnant. Lastly, on post-election, I think this is very, very, very important. If Gov made mistake, firm cannot solve their problems by held accountable. Because like there's no way you can hold firms accountable, right? Because firms were contracted by Gov. But if Gov were the spearhead of the policymaking in our side is failing, then you can hold them accountable by ensure the minister is fired and everything else. While in their side, politicians can just blame the companies and vice versa. So this is what creates worse accountability mechanism once again, because we cannot track exactly when one policy such as ICAN probably is failing, then who are responsible to that fault, right? So now we do understand the accountability mechanism in opening government is probably not perfect as well, but as long as we prove why the comparative in op is worse, then we win. Any closing extension would be extremely contingent on this analysis because we have analyzed the political dynamic in a chronological order. Second, on brain drain. I think this is very, very important. What companies that will make the good policy in their side? If you want a best company, then it's likely to be MNC such as BTG, McKinsey, etc. And most of these companies have similar characterization in which they outsource their employee from US and Europe to work in Asia, like countries such as Indonesia. So that means I want to directly debunk any of mitigations possibly came from all about brain drain. Consulting firms, sure, full of expertise, but it is not dominated by local people because they're used to working in international echo chamber. They also have other projects from different states. So Western employees are likely to be prioritized. That is why no matter how smart you are, the chance to employ smart people and valedictorian from OE or UGM is still very, very marginal. That means if consulting firm do not need service from local, and so does government as well, because government are relying on consulting, what would happen? People will go outside working for MNC who want their services, such as Unilever Singapore, who employ most of the Indonesian cum laude awardee from top university. I think in the long run, we will create even worse over-dependent on the consulting firms and neglect the local people. And I think this is important because now local people do not have any incentive to give feedback to their own nations because their efforts are underappreciated. That means you cut off 1 or 2 generations of capable individual that can give feedback to your community, and it is a net harm. Before that, sure. Closing? Opening?
Yeah, opening here. What is the likelihood under your side of the house that government want to take accountability to begin with? They want to say that, yes, it's our fault.
Great. It's now lead me nicely into policymaking. I want to answer this with 5 reasons why it's good on our side of the house. The first thing is because there is a reformation of education. Now, when you understand that you cannot rely on third parties, then mostly you will force the future generations to learn better about policymaking, not just learn something that is unnecessary like physics, biology, in which you probably cannot use this in the future or in the college. That means there's a certain transformation of educational system that happened in our side of the house to make people surely participate in politics even more. The second thing that I want to do here is you will put harder criticisms and even like accountability more in the politicians. Even since the beginning, you will teach the politicians about social responsibility, like what happened in Japan. When train was late for 1 minute, you will be harshly punished because most of the people do not rely on external party, but instead they rely on themselves. So this is exactly why our work is better because we create better cultures of responsibility. So now people are responsible because they're the spearhead of the development. And thirdly, and why local people is inherently good in contrast to the expertise from like MNC. Because I think no matter how good expertise from MNC, they do not build strong attachment to local people. And I think this was the reasons why most of the project done in Indonesia, like New Yogyakarta International Airport in Kulon Progo, built in a very, very worse way. And then they replace a lot of lands owned by local community because they just care about profit. And I think this is the reasons why you must employ local people to reduce the skepticism and protect one of the most vulnerable actor. They will find a way to discuss this because they had strong attachment to the community. And this is where your policy is going to be much more inclusive, much more representatives, and crucially, much more responsible and accountable. Proposed.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To continue, we call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panels, if OG's mechanism is they want to educate future policymaker and make it all sound good, I don't think that this is simply going to work, right? I'm also going to clarify to you a few things first. I don't think that local government is simply going to hire a consulting firm in terms of like which road I want to fix, I think it's most likely central government is going to consult in newer or nuanced industries such as AI, digital, or like, for example, technology. These types of industry that are usually still new and usually that government is starting to enter, but then these consulting firms have much more expert opinion, for example, right? And I don't think that we're just simply going to throw our responsibility away, because note that in the motion it says design. This means that policy, or for example, the initial politician's policy, whatever their goal is, can still exist with the help of consulting firm to design it and mechanize it better. I would also like to clarify. Yeah, okay, never mind. Why consulting firm then has a lot of interest? I think that the reason why they are credible to begin with and why they have a lot of project and they also handle multinational companies is because of three reasons. They have high accuracy in their decision making and policy making. The exact reason that they are very, for example, selective in their selection process for example, human resources, they have much more access to data because they're connected worldwide, for example. Second, the moment when government pay a huge amount of money, I think that they have a reputation and credibility to uphold under both sides. Hence, we think that under our side of the house, credibility and check and balance still exist. I'll explain to you why. Third, I think that OG also mentioned about hiring foreign talent. I think a majority of people is still going to be local talent because it's much more efficient as a profitable company for you to hire and train local talent in the long run, because rather than compensating and paying for foreigners to want to live in Indonesia, for example. And exactly because these companies are merit-based, I think that they're also going to value confidentiality and they're going to value quality a lot. So the moment if foreign MNC create policy, I think that government will still be the one who call the shots, whether they want, for example, this policy to run, whether you can mechanize it better or modify these. So I think that we're not just going to take the policy that has been created and throw it out there. There's still going to be check and balance, right? Now, I'm going to explain to you also why then this is morally unjustified. I think PM mentioned about moral justification. I'm going to respond directly with two explanation. First, I think talking about public consent, I don't think you need public consent or consent of everyone necessarily if you want to make policies such as like free lunch made by Prabowo that is unconsented by a lot of people. But that still does not matter as long as the impact is realized, right? But what type of impact you want? Do you want free lunch but you have higher taxes? Or you can consult in this consulting firm and have better mechanization. But the moment when you use this firm to help design the policy, they're able to take into account externalities, or for example, better alternative that was not initially found in the original cabinet. Second, I think public policy is filled with bureaucracy. So consent don't even matter, right? Look at the new presidential cabinet where a lot of people who stood by the elected president in the past and had helped campaign them before throw money into the fire. And now the elected president feels indebted. That's why a lot of people that is elected comes from, for example, their own party. So I think that under their side of the house, check and balance is exactly even worse because you don't have equal representation. But let's run with that idea if you don't have equal representation and that you have nepotism, for example, right? Why then check and balance still exists better under our side? At least with the moment when people feel the policy that has been created, the policy is not all that messed up. At least you have a third party that is able to maintain which policy should be prioritized, for example. How then is policy creation better under our side, or how is it designed? I think first, government would approach and pay consulting fee, of course, right? For in the big four company. I don't think it's simply going to like local government to small consulting firm. It's going to break credibility. I think that local government also care about their own credibility if the moment they fail. And hence, I think they're going to only trust the big four or like similar or big six or whatever, right? For example, government is going to seek advice on how to further expand into Indonesia's educational or technology sector. I think government would consult and hence policy such as budget allocation, what to implement, what strategy do we need to use is going to exist better. Thirdly, this is extremely better because consulting firm has resources unlike the local government or like the government institution in Indonesia or in any other country, basically. Yeah, but for example, to make a public policy that is about education, bureaucracy, such as, for example, you need to ask permission to all the other, for example, people inside the institution is going to take a lot of time. It's going to be easier under our side because first, you have data gathering and access to huge data. Government only has its own limited data. reliant, for example, Indonesia relies on BRIN, for example. But in most cases, this institution already work with a lot of researchers all around the world. The moment when you have accessibility to much better data, and hence, with your underdeveloped, for example, institution and your underdeveloped resources, you're at least able to access data that is that can be utilized better. I think last, exactly now that data is much more nuanced, this increases the chances of making better policy, such as how McKinsey helped US policy and technology, how they're able to use data from other country, for example, that are already much more in progress in terms of technology, and then they're able to help strategically build factory. Now, going to my first argument then, why is public policy much better under our side? I think that we want policy simply to be nuanced. We want accurate policy. Second, public policy is created by government members I think that is usually not objective. Now, I'm going to talk to you about check and balance. Central government in OG is worse because recently elected politicians need to directly put into action their policy, right? Because they are rushed by the people. They want to prove to the voter that yes, what I promised to you is going to exist. But then this is going to be very bad because there's no check and balance the moment you try to push this policy without much consideration. Under our side, you have, for example, a consulting firm that is able to provide you with necessary check and balance. Even if you push the policy to be as fast as possible so that people can feel the tangible benefit, at least you have the better resources to do so. At least you don't sacrifice, for example, by increasing PPN, for example, right? In order for you to run certain policy. Second, let's talk about what happens if accountability failed to exist. If government become the spearhead, I think that they're less likely going to want to take accountability anyway. I don't think that any government has the balls to say that, yes, it is our fault. Yes, we actually we used all of your taxpayer money and burnt it away. And second, I think that talking about the chances or the likelihood of policy to be able to succeed or accurately target the minorities or people who want to be targeted is better under our side. I already established to you the type of resources, the type of, for example, manpower that we have. Hence, I think that it's going to be better under our side, even if even with lower likelihood. Thank you. Higher likelihood.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. That wraps up the opening half. To start the closing half, we call upon the member of the government. Here.
Well, am I audible and visible?
Yep, you are both.
Okay. Then your pronoun she, her. POI through unmute, please, because I'm using Gtalks. My pen abis. Yeah. Okay. Or raise hand, I guess. Sure. I'll open.
Sorry, I want to make sure for everyone else in the room, is this audible?
Yes.
Audible.
Audible,
Is it?
yeah? All the other teams?
Audible.
Okay, cool. Making sure.
The analysis of bad or good government is basically the opening exchange. I think we need to assume that on both sides they are good because policies and bills will still need to be passed by government under both sides. Otherwise, anything or any change won't happen on the side of opposition as well. Us, SCG, we won't be contingent on the analysis of OG just says about, political dynamics that they say would be derivative. We won't really care about that. We won't really extend on that anyway. O's analysis as well is contingent to the fact that this is using these consulting firms. It's like they're assuming that this is a good and inexpensive alternative when they're inherently very expensive in a sense, right? Let me contextualize on how consulting firms in itself work on three things. The ones that governments use are most likely going to be the big companies, right? Since they have been established for a long time and have huge influence. Things like McKinsey and Company, for example, or BCG, like Boston Consulting Group, for example. They also have a lot of influence since they usually have a lot of branches spanning across the world as well. But B, they don't exclusively work with only the government. They're also working with other companies, which means they are profit-oriented and want money. If it means that they can get tens of millions of dollars, they would do it regardless of any ethical concerns or public interest that the opposition posits to you. But see, they're also not mere small decision makers like what the LO have told you. They're makers of the policy. These consulting firms are not merely advisors. They often play a direct role in actually shaping the public policy in itself. Their recommendations become the foundation of these proposals that this government is going to be giving to the public, for example. They have paid so much taxpayer money for it. Of course, they need to use it anyway, right? We're not saying that, oh, the consulting firms is bad, therefore, well, yeah, we need to, it's bad. So like what OG says to OO, right? Let's assume they're trustworthy, but we're still going to explain on why it's inherently bad. Because A, consulting firms is profit oriented. They only create populist agenda because they only prioritize personal gain over public good. This is the difference of us with OG. This is comparatively much more important because the metric of how policy should be is for it to reflect the public interest and well-being of their citizens. But B, what is our counterfactual? We want to demand for government to make these public policies because we want the policy making should be primarily the responsibility of officials that the people have elected, lawmakers,
Yeah.
etc. Which I think, yeah, OG have explained, right? Whatever. And like, why is a consulting firm in itself something that is very bad, right? Because A, just like what I said before, these consulting firms are profit oriented. They respond to special interest group, which is their clients. They prioritize client retention rather than public well-being in itself, which means one thing, they're unlikely to focus on minorities because they can't give out as much profit. Things like addressing gender-based violence, for example, is seen as something that is radical because those things are difficult to pass and to advocate for it, since it's not something that is populist and it's not going to give them the best ROI, for example. Plus, they have no obligation to do so because they have no responsibility towards the citizens. They have no responsibility towards the people, unlike what the government has. This is why the jargon in OO at the last few seconds of protecting minority doesn't really work anyway. What is the impact of this? Two things. A, this means that minority issues like affirmative actions, minority policies that affect vulnerable individuals within the country are not quote unquote economically efficient and won't give the best return of investments. Those important policies ended up not getting applied because these issues are frequently seen as, for example, politically sensitive or controversial. And secondly, there are also, or B, things like pro-woman and pro-black policies are not going to be promoted by these consulting firms, even when it's super important for these individuals for that bill to be passed anyway. Why? Because of two main things. Because it's not objectively a good thing. Those types of policies are not quantifiable as a good thing on paper. Policies that address social issues lack clear and quantifiable benefits in financial terms towards these consulting firms, right? This creates a conflict of interest, whether those consulting firms, because they have profit-driven incentives, for example, things like affirmative actions or anti-discrimination laws later, may be significant socially, but they do not translate to a quantifiable profit that these people could get, right? But secondly, they would want to prioritize retention over social good, like what I've said. Consulting firms prioritize client retention, which means they are more likely to align their recommendations with the interests of their paying clients rather than the broader public good, in a sense which the government have obligations to listen to, right? Those analysis by CG is the most important metric that you need to take into account because we engage with the most realistic public policies that are going to be passed and are not going to be passed under the side of opposition. Compared to government officials, they have the responsibility to give back towards the people. This creates better and check and balance because they have social contract, they have reputations to uphold. They want to be re-elected. They fear backlash from their opposing parties, for example. But secondly, they also have experts and policy makers. They're not like what OO says, like, oh, they do not have as much capital like all of these companies. No, they do. The reason why they're governments, they have connections towards other countries. They have bureaucratic processes with other countries as well, which means the network that they have inherently is also something that's very big, right? Which means those things that OO says is something that we also have under CG. But before that, yes, opening.
Yeah, if affirmative action is also not populist amongst politicians under your side, how then is it better under your side?
I said that on government side, on government side, we have the obligations for you to listen towards those affirmative actions, right? Because you are the ones that chosen by the people. But because these consulting firms are not the ones that are chosen by the people, that is inherently something that they are not obligated to do anyway, because what they need to do is gain profit. But let's retract back to the wording of the motion. This house regrets the increasing influence. Why the increasing in itself it is harmful? Because firstly, it is wasting precious and limited money that comes from the people. Because A, under the side of opposition, regardless of the policy being good or not, it is the absolute harm under the side of opposition in paying these consulting firms. Because firstly, they're not chosen by the public. So in a principle standpoint of democracy, it is inherently very bad, right? But secondly, they're also hella expensive. there are tens of millions of dollars that you need to pay out towards these consulting firms, and those two are the absolute benefit of government side, regardless of any of the policy outcome that will happen. OO says that the government has limited money, then there's not just simply bad resource allocation. They put more economic output to spend on those firms and not on the policies that could have been used for research and development, drafting legislation, or creating infrastructure for the people, which is under the side, the prerequisite for them to get those check and balances is you need to hire multiple consulting firms at the end of the day, which means the government needs to spend more of those precious taxpayer money that you have paid towards the government. Proud to propose.
We thank the member of the government for that speech. To continue the debate, we call upon the member for the... Wait, can we pause a minute? I want to use apa? Obat-tetes mata. Staring at the screen all day is killing me. But yes. Okay. Member of OP, time and place is yours.
Okay, checking, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. Oh yeah. For POI, please just raise your hand. Please don't badger me. Especially with verbal POI. That's 1, 2. Any pronoun for the debate, and yeah, setting my timer. What's needed to be considered on every bench is that on how a current government problem is probably on some level they're incapable to do every analysis to design an optimal public policy. This is why on Indonesia, on how the journey to IKTP to integrate with BPJS and KIP is going to be exists a lot of problem that does end up badly with corruption. The problem that exists is because there's too many unexpected barriers, too complicated bureaucracy like pungli that needs to be solved and rooted for a long time. This is why it's so much better for us to have a much better influence on a objective third party that still have a huge bargaining power to the people with political interest. See, this is how even country in West, when there's a political dynasty exists that on the status quo, still be run for a really long time because they don't have anyone to check and balance them directly. These people are not the one who are suddenly going to be good. Like what both government bench want to prove in this debate, that still never answer on their side, right? This is why we CEO will open the debate to explain why it's so much better for the influence to exist. But before that, two things, right? One, let's kick CG to the debate because I don't think they can contribute anything goodly, right? Because and it's not fair for them to push the burden to us to explain how consulting should fix social issues or even govern like minority affirmative action. Because that's definitely a social movement burden to fulfill, which is still open to consulting influence anyway, since they're literally open to work with anyone to extend their influence because this is literally their jargon to be a better to make a good impact. But two, what opening debate makes is a differentiation of the influence of consulting firms on how they actually operate in the status quo, right? I think let's differ this because the workload is definitely consists of analyzing data and running a model on how does it actually implemented in the real world, i.e. analyzing the data for it to be fit into the relevancy matrix, like using analysis of nutritional food by Pabo for the people, or how does it actually affect. They will keep up and show the data to the government on how it actually a bad or good beforehand. This doesn't show that they actually have the final say because the government will still have the final say because this is why we can take away on two things here. One, this means that government still cannot run away from the blame anyway, as OG because OG already also say because people doesn't know how it actually policy actually created. Therefore, they will be still blamed by this. People will still criticize them constructively. There's still a check and balance method here. But second, we don't get why it's harmful for private sector to get entangled in the implementation. Because I think in order to build public policy, a lot of people are need to be taught in this because it goes to a lot of process of bargaining and required like negotiation. Therefore, it's already going to a lot of process of check and balance anyway because this is we want to get the best for the people, right? This is why we're gonna enter the debate in two things: the justification, but two, how does this create a political balance in the end of the day? One, let's talk about justification. We say we not public policy is significantly important because it shapes the perception of the people to government. Because we want the operation with a good trust that cannot be optimal if that is cannot be sustained to a policy that's still fucked up in the status quo. This is the reason why, and this is why influence of consulting becomes important. Like this is exactly the reason why Anish lost in the presidential election, because he didn't hire a good consulting firm to seek way to introduce his programs. Unlike Pablo, who did it and came up with makan gratis, which is inarguably easier to accept and understand to gain people trust. This is the real life example on how the influence are currently going. And we say this is still a good thing if the government can actually use the rise of this to make sure that they can get the people's trust in this. This is why public trust is going to be most important thing in the debate, because that's the prerequisite of government having functional public policy. Because public policy needs the approval and compliance of its citizens, right? But why then it's most achievable on the road side? Two things. One, consulting firms vary in terms of functionality, right? And I think they're more specialized in terms of what they have and more manpower to do. They are much more aware of what they have data and research. They have the precedence of what already happened, right? Therefore, they only need to adjust it a little bit to ensure the relevancy and make sure give a good reaction from the people or give a tangible impact. The portrayal to this is that the reaction from citizens that when they see the policy that is on the end side, they will be much more secure, feeling secure on this, because they actually finally acknowledge that the quality that designed by the government. This gives a sense of security and trust to the people, and now they are more keen to much more contributing on political participation. Now people will want to and understand what's the differences between bad and good policy. But two, corporations are entirely different actor than government anyway, which is check and balance system are going to be important, because if they fail to create a positive impact, they can lose their privilege in that said country. Firms has interest to spread and influence spending. This is why they're going to work competently to create a good impact. This is really important, because the check and balance system on the good firm to ensure its capability itself. This is why check and accountability will exist on our side, right? Because it's going to be better in comparison on government. Uh, the additional stakeholder that exists on government on our side, the additional stakeholder that exists is free from the bias, and there will be like a corporation bureaucracy that exists to ensure the check and balance, because this is a really huge project, probably going to like manager, senior manager, or even supervisor, right? But way then the public trust is the most important thing in the debate, because this is an evaluative motion. The way what the teams that should win is which team can consider beneficial most part on the third party. This is why we already win in one, the product of public policy, but two, on the implementation itself. But two, the second one is very important, because the government was a contingent to how much trust is given by the function optimally is exclusively achieved on closing opposition, right? This is why it's so much the nuance on giving the rise of a celebration. But second thing is to ensure the political balance that exists, which is determined to who are the people who are determined on people who are designing behind the policy. Like these are probably conscious from every people that you don't expect. Like it's probably come from both left and right wing side of the politics. We're investing in government, still wishing for ROI. This is the fundamental standard operational procedure in every governmental model. We say both sides of politics still want a successful policy anyway, right? Because they want a profit that comes from this. This is where consulting influence is important, because we want to ensure that there's support to the government. In comparison, opposition still cannot answer. Where you want to make a government to be a standalone body, it's going to be shaky anyway, but there hasn't been a characterization as to why government can be a better as a standalone body. Here's to say that information or support given will be left out because they don't want to invest anymore, losing their trust from this stakeholder also, which is also important, proud to open on closing opposition.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech. To continue, we call and to wrap up government side of the house. We call upon the government to appear here.
Am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Okay. POI, directly unmute yourself. OG was correct in pointing out that consulting firms are bad, but notice how the entire context is very dismissive to OO talking about constituents' power to pass bills and legislation, right? We think this is where my members' extension becomes most important inside this entire debate because it enables all of the harm that undermines democracy and society's representation, which is a prerequisite of the entire case about political participation and how people are going to get good policies at the end of the day, directly contending with all three other benches, right? But talking about the process of policy making, directly engaging with OO as well. I think first of all, there's no incentive analysis for them to actually create these minority policies for representation, right? Because minorities will always worth less in business when they cannot give you as much profit and might jeopardize your biggest client base, which is the majority in the first place. I think that is the reason why on opposition bench, if you address gender-based violence, you will be seen as non-populist. If you focus on police brutality, for example, right, you attack the majority, and you will be seen as radical. Hence, why the entire idea and the entire proposal will never be taken by these consulting firms anyway in the end of the day. I think in both of these scenarios, you risk retention. Therefore, consulting firms are unlikely going to conform with pro-women or even pro-black policies that is unique to protecting these minorities as well, right? This is also what responding to CO when they assert that, oh, social movement will still exist and consulting firm will still care about this. No, they won't, because both of these agenda are directly contradicting with each other. Most likely, they will respond to majority because they're bigger in quantity and can give you more money as well. Exactly because they say that these consulting firms are independent bodies, they are neutral bodies who still seek for profit. That is the reason why there is no obligation for them to give back to society. There's no obligation for them to actually talk about these underground problems that these minorities are going through, right? I think this is the most important case because if you want to argue about healthcare, education, or even housing, like what the opening exchange wants to talk about, who the hell would think reduction of quality is good, right? Politicians and the people, regardless of not being engineers, for instance, knows that making roads is good for the people in general. Education reformation in OG is quite extreme because you cannot just assume that everyone wants to become a politician. This is also what answers OO about literacy, right? Because consulting firms are there to design policies, not to write an article for people to understand what actually happens when you create these policies. What is the specific knowledges that people need to get at the end of the day? Therefore, I don't see why opening exchange is even important. What's uniquely important in this debate is talking about minorities, which my member has already touched upon, right? Who were never the popular base for people to talk about, and only for the government has the incentive to give back, exactly because you need to shut off oppositional challenges towards your power. And opposition parties, they do not want them to rise into power to actually challenge the incumbent, right? I think that is the main reason as to why government, irrespective of them being populist as well, there's still obligation and there are still additional incentive for them to actually cater towards people on the ground, and especially the minorities who are lesser in quantity. But secondly, then, right, I think even if CO wants to argue that, oh, government's electoral incentives still exist under their side because they can pass these policies, right? Those incentives are diminished exactly because you have an increasing influence of consulting firm. This is true because of three reasons. Firstly, because most likely the increasing influence bypasses the constitution because consulting firms can easily implement corporate tactic, for instance, to convince politicians to boost their KPI and make themselves look better in the eyes of the public. If any, conforming with the consulting firm is exactly what boosts your electoral popularity. It is not going to be responsive towards the people on the ground. But secondly, then, especially with the increasing influence, competition among consulting firms is not to create good policies for the people, right? The competition exists for them to become more saturated in order to maintain their position inside the parliament, exactly like what OO asserted to you inside their own extension, right? There's even more urgency then for consulting firms to only focus on populist agenda that directly affirms to all the case that my member has already brought to you in our case on CG. But thirdly, then, I think people would only refer to consulting firms because they are deemed as more professional later. This already clashes with their entire case about cost efficiency as well, right? Because to have different voices and with the increasing influence, means that you need to hire different types of consulting firms. You need to pay multiple consultation fee, multiple services fee, and multiple platform fee, and etc., which costs you a lot of money. This is bad because states' money, instead of being contributed towards the people, it's spent on consultation and not on policies in itself, which could have been better and comparative, right? Because you can create better R&D under our side. You can draft legislation. You can create infrastructure for the people for them to get the benefits of these policies and the benefits of all of these social welfare that's being given to them on the ground. I think OO tried to run away by saying that, oh, you can still dismiss policy. Sure, you can, but what are you doing then? They've already paid these consulting firms, right? If every single design policy is canceled, that means OO is wasting all of the people's tax money just to deny policies that they are creating, that they're quote unquote created by experts, which they told you is really good, is flawless, and if it is that good in the first place, then why are you canceling all these policies in the first place, right? How do you weigh this entire contribution against opposition bench, right? I think all of the materials that we give you on CG suggest that regardless of the government's role, we contend the consulting firm may or may not be good, right? But even if they are good, the increasing influence dictates over democracy, dictates over what these politicians would actually decide to do at the end of the day. That is what we regret under CG's role. Before that opening.
Yeah. If I'm pretty sure accessibility argument in this case is fiat for opposition, but how will it even be cheaper if your policy has more likelihood to fail the moment you cannot consult with anyone?
How is it a fiat? It's already clarified by the CAP that you need to pay more fee to actually hire these consultants, right? You need to pay more fee for all of the, for all of the processes of the bureaucracies for you to involve all these external helps anyway, which is why on a comparative is already way worse on their side. But comparative on the other side of the house, exactly because you have this existing capital, it has to be saturated, it has to be concentrated to actually create these meaningful policies for the people on the ground. On a comparative, it's better on our side because government work independent from the influence of consulting firms. Public policies will be more reflective over the most urgent issue as well for the people. This means, first of all, this is going to be good because you still have lawmakers, have political experts, researchers, constitution, etc., to make good policy. But secondly, then, we already told you that non-populist agenda will also be answered because they need to win over society so the opposition parties wouldn't rise to power towards the incumbent. How does this weigh us over opening government as well, right? I think there's two things. First of all, OG's principle of consent falls short because not everyone consented to being in a state anyway, nor did everyone vote for the incumbent. But even if that matters, CG is the only team who complete that principle of consent and vulnerability because you need to care about the minority because A, they're the ones who face the most discrimination, the most harassment because of the government's incapability at first. But second, there's no other actors who would care about these minorities other than government who governs over the entire public and who needs to answer towards every layers of society as well. But secondly, it's simply on scale, right? Because it's not just a debate about a developing country. We need to focus on every single democratic state that directly needs all these good policies as well. We already gave you several reasons as to why government is going to be the best actor to actually act in place, and the increasing influence will simply diminish all the check and balances and all the representation that should have been there for a democratic state. So proud to propose.
We thank the government whip for that speech. Last but not least, we call upon the opposition whip here.
So checking if I'm audible.
Okay, the audio is from a different device. Yeah, you're audible and visible.
Okay, so okay, for POI, just raise your hand and I know not raise your hand. Please unmute because I won't be looking at the chat box. And yeah. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. One important question that I want to ask the closing government, right, is were there any affirmative action given to given by the government to the minority before the consulting influence is even in rising? Because if they can't even mention one until now, you shouldn't buy it because the president is supposed to be to establish their government incentive. And the fact that like under their side there's going to be more minority affirmative actions is going to be questionable at best, and their entire case falls, right? But let's tackle down their case point by point. They come into this debate talking about how consulting firms are corporations that are profit oriented, and therefore it's harmful because policymaking needs to reflect the public interest, right? But we think that's one important response to this. That's just not how this works. That's not how the designing of the policy making actually works under opposition, right? Because they're arguing in the motion that the consulting firms is making policies based on the government request, right? But the problem with closing government is they're operating as if suddenly the government is going to turn into a consulting firm that is going to drive what kind of policies that are going to be made, and therefore they won't make policies for minorities. That's not how it works because the government is still the government, and the consulting firm only designs public policies by request from the government. This looks like when a recent issue is arising that the government doesn't have enough data about, and is something that such as artificial intelligence that has the potential to be harmful if not regulated properly. This is when the government will ask the relevant consulting firms to design a public policy to mitigate the potential harms. So at the end of the day, whether or not there will be public policies about uplifting minority lives and the affirmative action is going to be reliant on the government itself, whether or not they want to publish and make this kind of policy. But at least under our side, when the government does want to create an affirmative action policy, we can ensure that the product is better because they have more resources and and data and overall more power and free from the government corruption. But even if it's true that that's how it works, that suddenly the consulting firm is going to drive what kind of policy that's going to be made by the government, I think that government under your side wouldn't want to cater to minority issue anyways, because you can prove why politicians under your side is going to be very virtuous. No, you can't just say that we must assume that the government is good, because that is not the status quo, especially in the developing countries, because that's where there's still lots of corruption and nepotism, right? But B, we think that corporations are not that evil anyways, because their success is driven by the public perception also. If they lose their reputations because they create policies that are directly harming minorities or just not catering to them at all, the public, the social movement, and the minority communities itself still have the power to boycott, publicize their wrongdoings that will lead to things such as their stock value decreasing, that will also harm their profit, and therefore it will not lead to this kind of harm. But let's move on to opening government. Right. Firstly, on their idea of brain drain, we think that this is a false urgency, right? Because at the end of the day, the local would still be higher in terms of their merits, because these corporations would need to partner with local parties to get the data and check the relevance, right? But secondly, I think it's going to be worse under government bench. If the government bench want to include locals only in the design process, where we already explained to you how predatory the current political player currently is. You're letting these self-centered people to be the biggest stakeholder, where they are unlikely to care about the people in town without another stakeholder that is going to check and balance them and provide the accountability metric, right? But on their idea of consent, why consent doesn't matter and why it will be symmetric anyways. Because firstly, at the end of the day, public hardly consent to who is leading them anyways. Why? Most of them don't even like the politicians that they elect, because politicians that exist are mostly people that have a suspicious and questionable background, that have unforgivable flaws. But at the end of the day, they will still have to choose, because it's better to choose the lesser evil rather than risk having the worst possible candidate be elected. And B, public at the end of the day doesn't even know what goes on behind closed door in the government office. Regardless of whether or not consulting firms design public policies or not, there are still many things and many unknown stakeholders to the public that are part of the public policy making process that the public did not consent to. This proves to you that consent at the end of the day is going to be symmetrical on both sides. This is a different response for opening opposition, right? But even if it's true, it doesn't matter anyways, because what matters in this kind of motion is the practicality. Even if the public is mad because they did not consent some consulting firm to make their public policies, we think that their anger will die down the moment the policy that's being published is a policy that they actually agree with and has an overall great benefit among society. So we tell you that the team that wins is not the team that proves the unimportant metrics such as consent, but the team that can prove that they can create better public policies and gain the trust of the citizens so they can actually comply and guarantee the success of the public policies application, right? But next, on the idea of accountability, why it will still exist under our side and is going to be better. But notice then, Judge, that the accountability and benefit under OG is questionable at best, because then the accountability measure and good policy measures is reliant on the politics under their side being a good politicians that are virtuous and want to make policies that are best for the citizen, which is highly questionable with the context that we already being brought to you. Exactly why we have a president with a 2.3 GPA. They cannot dismiss this then. But why accountability is actually better under our side? With a reason as simple as there's an additional stakeholder that exists that is free from the bias that is held by the government. Because designing public policies is not, as government claim, that consultant firms are going to design the policy and it's immediately going to be passed, and therefore there is no accountability measures. This is not true, because the policy is of course going to be reviewed by the government first, and there's going to be a thorough and long discussion and evaluation process of finalizing the policies before it is being published. So under our side, there are two stakeholders reviewing the public policies. Under their side, there's only going to be one. It's clearer then who has the better accountability measures and check and balance. Lastly then, why we win over opening opposition? We think that opening opposition did a great job in explaining what a consultant firm is, what are their roles, but they did not necessarily prove why all these things can actually gather public trust and guarantee the success of the application of the public policies. Why is this important? Because we already tell you that the government is an entity that's probably published many public policies that harm their citizens in the long run, that causes them to lose trust towards the government entirely. There are many people who are a victim of failed government policies who have their lives practically ruined because of incompetent people in the government. This is the kind of thing that will halt the application of the public policy itself, because government is just going to be met by harsh criticisms. This is something that can only be mitigated by consulting firms designing public policies rather than internal government. Because why? Because even if someone doesn't trust the government because of their actions and the things that they didn't pass, at least they still have towards the big four consulting firm that is reputable. reputable. This is when people can give the government a certain degree of benefit of the doubt, if you want to call it, something that is exclusive to consulting firms designing public policies, because they're a different entity from the government. This is important in the context when new issue arises that's still lack of awareness. Take the rise of AI, for example. There's going to be many people who still doubt the actual dangers of AI. When there's a public policy regulating it and it's only done with the government, people who distrust the government still continue to not recognize its dangers regardless of the policy. But if they know that it's being designed by a reputable big four consulting firms, that's when they can be swayed and finally evaluate if this kinds of thing is truly dangerous. Proud to close the debate. Thank you.
We thank the right. There you go. We thank the opposition whip for that debate. That wraps up round 5. Yay! Thank you for that wonderful debate. Virtually cross floors with one another, and please stay here if someone wants to leave. Like, the other person should stand by, so it's not hard to call for OA later on. Thank you so much.